Finnigan as our third panel speaker for our first London later. Just so you know, we're going to finish up, we'll give David's full half hour, so we'll finish up at 25 to 9, and then there will be time for a bit of conversation and another drink afterwards. We've been told we need to be out by 10 to 9, so there will be a little bit of more chit-chat at the end. David Finnigan is an Australian science theatre artist and festival director. With Science Theatre Ensemble Boho, David creates interactive performances working with research scientists from organisations such as University College London, who he's working with at the moment here, and the Powerhouse Museum Sydney. So David's going to talk to us about the Best Festival Ever project, which is a very modestly titled project. Best Festival Ever. And he produced that in collaboration with the UCL Environment Institute and the UK Theatre Company Coney. So Best Festival Ever, How to Manage a Disaster, is a show about system science for 25 players, which takes place around a table.
Thank you guys very much for having us. And thank you, Dan and Nicola. That was extremely erudite and hella humbling. So I'm extremely intimidated, and also this is the very first time in my life that I've put together a PowerPoint presentation. So that's exciting. This could all go horribly wrong. The computer could catch on fire. And so that's why I'm pumped tonight. I'm a science theatre artist from Australia, and I want to talk with you a bit about the Best Festival Ever project, and also to ask you guys a particular question, which is something I've been kind of chewing on for a while. But first, just a bit of background. I'm currently travelling through the UK on a research fellowship, which is funded through the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust, looking at art science practice in different parts of the world. My background is as a playwright from Canberra in Australia. I'm a complete layman, I have no science training. And in 2006, my company Boho began collaborating with research scientists. At that time, we felt that the work that we were creating, the theatre we were making, was too insular and talking about people like us to people like us. So engaging with scientists for us was a way of forcing us to learn new things and adopt new approaches, which was really valuable for us in creating art. Also, really importantly, we wanted to contribute something to society, which maybe with some hubris, and to help make a change. And that's something we'll talk a bit about later. So we began creating interactive performances based on concepts from game theory, network theory, complex systems science, and climate and global change. Our first show back in 2007 was called A Prisoner's Dilemma, and it was about game theory and the prisoner's dilemma thought experiment. So game theory is a field of science that looks at situations where the right thing to do depends on what other people do. So, for example, this is £1. This is for you. You can choose to give some of it, none of it, or all of it to this gentleman here. You don't have to give him any, you can give him the whole pound if you want. You have 5 seconds to decide how much you give. You just gave the whole pound. Okay, 80 pence, 20 pence. Thank you very much. So we used to play that game as part of the show and different variations on it. And what we found was that people behave very differently when you tweak certain knobs of that game. For instance, if you let people make their choice privately versus if you ask them to do it in front of everyone, people are very different in what they give. People are less generous with their friends than they are with strangers. If you ask a guy to give some amount of money to a girl that he doesn't know, invariably he will give the whole amount. And there was this variation which I always found really interesting. This is £50, this is for you. You can give some of it, none of it, or all of it back to me. You have 5 seconds to decide how much you can keep. 5, 4, 2, 1. So, we lost a lot of money doing that show. But in 2009, we did a show in the house of an Australian historian named Manning Clark, the most famous Australian historian. And the show was about complex systems science and Australian history. So as the framework for the show, we used a thought experiment from a physicist named Per Back, who was at the Santa Fe Institute in the 70s and 80s. And he had this idea of what he called the sand pile model, where he said, imagine dropping grains of sand on a table. And if you keep going over time, it forms a pile of sand. And if you keep dropping grains of sand, eventually avalanches start to occur. Now, when you drop a grain of sand, it might do nothing, or it might trigger a small avalanche, or it might trigger a huge avalanche. And there's no way of telling which it's going to be beforehand. Big avalanches are less common, but avalanches of all sizes are possible. The pile exists in a state of what Purbach called self-organised criticality. So we use that as an analogy for the nation of Australia, or indeed any nation. We said a nation like Australia exists in a state of self-organised criticality. New people appear and new events occur continually in Australia's history. Most have no effect. A few cause a small amount of change, and very rarely a person or a decision takes place which causes the country to move in an entirely new direction. And looking back, we tend to ascribe great importance to those people and events that triggered great changes, and we tend to forget that at the time they were just one of many potential catalysts. When a system is poised on the brink of change, it takes only a small push to push it in one direction or another. So the show took place in different rooms around Manning Clark's house, and each of those rooms had an interactive installation, a performance piece, based on a different turning point in Australia's history. And we took the audience through, and at each point they could make a decision which would lead Australia down a different path. So over the course of the show, along with us, the audience built an alternative Australian history. In some instances they took us very far to the right and kind of toward a kind of apartheid. In other instances it was a very socialist, multicultural and progressive, socially progressive state, but every night was a kind of very different story. We then did a show in 2010 commissioned by the Powerhouse Museum in Sydney called True Logic of the Future, which was about climate and global change in Australia. And the show asked whether the two-party political system that we have is actually capable of responding meaningfully to a problem like climate change that takes place over a timescale of decades. And we asked if, when the consequences of climate change became too much, people might actually choose to adopt a form of government that was not democratic, that could perhaps promise to deliver that kind of change. So that show prompted a lot of discussion and debate, which we felt really interesting. But the problem that we faced there was that because we were presenting it in a theatre, we were more or less presenting to a theatre-going audience, which was middle-class, socially progressive, well-educated, already across these sorts of topics, very much preaching to the choir. So we very consciously decided that we wanted to try and make a work that could sit outside of traditional arts contexts. In 2011, Boho undertook a residency at University College London at the Environment Institute, working with climate modelers and system scientists. And we were tasked with creating a new performance work around system science. So I'm going to do a very hatchet job of explaining system science, and I hope all of the scientists in the room, if I really fumble, if you could just shake your head, sadly, that would be much appreciated. So systems refers to the systems that are all around us, whether it's ecosystems, economic or political, social systems, or climate and weather, and system science studies them and how they fit together. It looks at the links and interactions between things, maybe more so than separately looking at things themselves. So for example, you might use a systems framework to view a city as an adaptive, complex system, self-organizing in varied ways in response to both internal interactions and external influences. And system science might give you some understanding of how a city changes over different timescales. Urban traffic jams occur in minutes, stock market crashes happen over days and weeks, cycles in housing prices over months, sometimes years, and the process of urban gentrification can take decades. So what might appear abrupt through one lens is sort of slow or insignificant or even invisible from another. And system scientists system science is just a different framework for viewing how cities and all these sorts of spaces are balancing ecosystems and human functions, assessing interconnections and interdependencies, and just helping people make decisions from a broader perspective. So we were looking at producing a work that conveyed ideas or explored ideas from system science, such as what is a complex adaptive system, what even is one of those, interconnectivity, how systems are kind of connected in strange ways, and how often changing something over here can result in a really unexpected consequence elsewhere in the system. Also ideas of feedback loops, tipping points, phase transitions, thresholds, etc. So this is an example of a systems model that UCL had produced to explore how cities produce health outcomes in individuals. And our task was to take models, conceptual models like this, and figure out how to turn them into an interactive performance of some kind. So what we created was a show that takes place around a table for a playing audience of 15 to 25 roughly, something that could fit in a theatre, but also in a classroom or science centre or a boardroom or anywhere that you can put a table, basically. We deliberately wanted to go very lo-fi with this show, in fact no-fi, and so the interactive mechanisms were all drawn from board gaming. Turns out there's some extremely sophisticated board game mechanisms that have come a long way since when I was a kid at least. So the show gave the audience their own complex system to manage. And the question was for a long time during our research, what system we would ask people to manage. Originally, we were thinking of modelling a river system, a watershed system, and getting audiences to make choices about mixed-use agricultural landscapes and different sort of stakeholder usage, urban landscapes, rural landscapes. And the problem that we faced there was that whenever we told people that we were making a river system management simulation, their eyes kind of glazed over and they went to a quiet place inside their head and they would say something like, that sounds extremely worthy. So we decided instead to model a music festival. And the reason we chose a music festival is that it's actually, we found a really good example of a complex adaptive system. You have your biophysical systems, the soil composition, water flow, flora and fauna, and then on top of that you have built infrastructure. A festival, a lot of the time, is actually like building a temporary city that lasts for a week or so. And then within and around that you have social, economic and governance subsystems. So we felt it was actually a really good analogy for a lot of the sorts of issues that we face in managing ecosystems and kind of more broadly systems that humans are embedded in. Our festival model looked something like this, which was a way of kind of compacting a lot of what we'd extracted about systems into something that we could turn into a game. So in our show, which is called Best Festival Ever, How to Manage a Disaster, the audience is placed in charge of a new 3-day music festival out in the woods. And through a series of interactive sequences using board game mechanisms, they are in charge of choosing the bands, building the festival site, and managing the whole event. I want to give you an example of one of those interactive board game sequences. The only image I have is a photo from a very early version, a very early scratch of the show, which I'm worried will colour your idea of the whole show, but I'm going to do it anyway. No apologies. So, at the top right is someone's jeans that was standing behind the table. But in the centre you see a large board, and this game represented this was how the audience selected the lineup for the festival. So the large round board represents the festival budget, and that was balanced on a very tall spike, so the budget could actually tilt and wobble. And on the board are various blocks of different sizes, shapes and weights at different distances from the centre of the board. Now, on one side are bands, and the larger the band, the larger the block, the bigger the band. So you have your big indie band, your trashy party DJ, your teenage YouTube sensation, or your 80s pop star. And to program those artists, all you have to do is take them off the board and place them on the festival. But obviously when you do that, the budget starts to tilt. And so in order to keep the budget balanced and not sort of collapse your entire budget before the festival begins, you have to take pieces from the other side, which represent sponsors. So there are small sponsors, such as Nintendo or Revlon or Quaker Oats, who might only give you a little bit, but only have a very little bit that they want in return. Quaker Oats might insist on being the only porridge vendor in the festival, which is not too hard to accede to. But the bigger blocks represent larger sponsors who will give you more but demand more in return. For example, Marlborough might give you quite a bit of money but insist on having a large banner behind your main stage, which could cause conflict with your artists and audience. And either way, no matter what sponsors you take, you're going to have to satisfy their demands later in the show. So this was an example for us of trade-offs that occur within systems, and how if you're managing a system, you're going to start to face very quickly the fact that you can't make all the choices you want. And very quickly people realised that whatever choices they made, they also faced lock-in later on when they had to actually deliver on the sponsor's demands. So this is a video of a scratch performance held at the Battersea Arts Centre at the end of 2012. Now the show had 3 modes that it moved between. There are the kind of interactive, hands-on board game sequences where the audience are looking after various aspects of the festival. In some games they're trying to prevent people from jumping the fence and breaking into the festival site, or they might be managing security in the mosh pit, or making sure that the artist's campsite doesn't wash away in a flood. Then there are the theatre sequences. So once the audience have played these games, they then sort of sit back and experience the results of those games, where they hear the story of this music festival from the perspective of the characters within it, the artists, the producers, the audience that have come along to this event, as the festival moves towards its final night and potential catastrophe. Then there are lecture components, where we very directly bring the audience out of that world, and we kind of overtly talk about the concepts that this is based on. So we might say, the reason that we've shown you this is that this is an example of a feedback loop, and here are the other instances in which you might encounter feedback loops, and maybe talk about Arctic ice, or very consciously bring them out. And what was the most interesting thing about this scratch season was that the audience really responded to those 3 modes. They really enjoyed switching very rapidly between doing something, hearing the results in the story setting, and then hearing the ideas behind it, and then back into doing something. So the show really kind of is built on this very rapid movement between the 3. It's designed for an audience of a sort of 14 up. You can see there's a fairly young group on this occasion, and also a general public audience. So our aim is we're looking at presenting it at the London Science Museum, the first full production later this year. So the hope is to take this work into theatres and classrooms and science centres, conferences, but also we've been invited in one instance to present it to the board of an Australian bank as part of their corporate training or team building exercise, which for us is a really interesting opportunity to kind of talk about systems and talk about ecology with that particular demographic who, as I mentioned before, is not a sort of theatre-going audience necessarily. Now the music festival show, this first sort of setting, is also a bit of a proof of concept for us, for the idea of doing this kind of tabletop, interactive, systems-based performance. Our intention in the future is that this show, once it exists in its final version, will be able to tour to venues and organisations, folds up in a box nice and easily, unrolls on the table, so that we can tour that, but also wherever we take it, we can work with whoever we're working alongside, whoever the partners are, be it venues or organisations, and actually create a bespoke systems model of their system, whatever it is. So, for instance, we could go to a venue and, in collaboration with that community, create a kind of conceptual systems map of, say, a suburb in a city, or a school, or an organisation, with the people who are part of that organisation, and then taking that map or model, turn it into a game, and then leave that game or create that game in partnership with those people. It doesn't cost much to create a very cheap board game if you have just a few simple materials. We think, or we hope, that that's a really interesting and playful way for people to engage with the systems that they're embedded in a slightly different angle. So the question that I have around all this, and part of the reason that I've taken this research fellowship and I'm travelling to different places looking at art science practice, it goes back to our reason for beginning to collaborate with scientists in the first place. And part of our intention when we began collaborating was that we wanted to make better art, and it made a huge difference to our art once we started talking to scientists in different fields and stopping staring at our own navel. But beyond that, we also had a hope of making some sort of social impact, however that plays out. We felt that we've come to a point in history where we're more reliant than ever on science and technology, but at the same time, there's a huge gap in understanding of and engagement with science. It's obviously had consequences in things like the climate debate. So our hope was that artists might be able to help close that gap, that art could help make science meaningful and relatable for people, and to help them connect with those concepts. So there's some resonance for me in what Dan was saying at the end of his talk around the sort of social justice ideas. But the problem is that after 8 or 9 years of travelling down this path, that's still just a hypothesis for me, and I still don't know if that is possible or happening or a complete fantasy and fiction. I feel that there is a strong possibility that in fact science art is always going to be a niche activity and limited to the sorts of people who are here tonight. In which case there is nothing wrong with that, because the sort of work, the art that has been created through that joining stands on its own merit. But for me, I've harboured this hope that we might be able to create some sort of genuine shift in people's perception of science and engagement with science. Now, obviously I'm really invested in the answer being yes, we can, and there's a chance I'm shooting myself in the foot by even asking the question, but I don't know. And so that's a question I wanted to throw to you guys, being an extremely erudite group of people, whether or not you think that that is possible, whether it's happening, and I'm maybe embarrassed to find out that it's going on at a huge scale that I'm not aware of. But yeah, that's something I want to throw to you. In the meantime, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Dan and Nicola, those were amazing. Thank you, Heather, and thank you guys for listening.